December 1989. The grainy television screens across Romania flickered with images that would change everything. Nicolae Ceausescu, the man who had ruled with an iron fist for over 2 decades, lay dead alongside his wife Elena. Their execution marked the violent end of communist rule, but for accountant Ioan Stoica, watching from his modest apartment in Cluj-Napoca, it represented something else entirely: opportunity. While millions of Romanians celebrated in the streets, Stoica's mind was already calculating. The revolution had torn down the old system, leaving behind a vacuum of power, desperate people, and most importantly for his plans, complete economic chaos. In that moment of national liberation, the seeds of Romania's greatest financial disaster were quietly being planted in one man's ambitious mind. For 45 years, Romania had lived under the suffocating grip of communist rule. Citizens had grown accustomed to state-controlled everything. Their jobs, their homes, their very thoughts. Private enterprise was not just discouraged, it was illegal. Most Romanians had never seen a stock market, understood interest rates, or made investment decisions. They had been conditioned to trust authority figures completely, to believe that the state would provide for all their needs. This financial naivety, bred through decades of communist control, would prove to be fertile ground for exploitation. When the system collapsed overnight, these same trusting citizens found themselves adrift in a capitalist world they didn't understand, making them perfect targets for someone who understood exactly how to manipulate their desperate hope for a better future. For 45 years, Romania had lived under the suffocating grip of communist rule. Citizens had grown accustomed to state-controlled everything: their jobs, their homes, their very thoughts. Private enterprise was not just discouraged, it was illegal. Most Romanians had never seen a stock market, understood interest rates, or made investment decisions. They had been conditioned to trust authority figures completely, to believe that the state would provide for all their needs. This financial naivety, bred through decades of communist control, would prove to be fertile ground for exploitation. When the system collapsed overnight, these same trusting citizens found themselves adrift in a capitalist world they didn't understand, making them perfect targets for someone who understood exactly how to manipulate their desperate hope for a better future. Stoica was a master manipulator who understood human psychology better than most trained psychologists. He knew that trust, once established, could be leveraged exponentially. The first rule of his scheme was simple: always pay the early investors and pay them exactly on time. When Maria Popescu received her 4,000 Romanian lei after investing just 500, she didn't just celebrate. She became a true believer and, more importantly, a walking advertisement. She told her neighbors, her family, her former colleagues. She showed them the money, real cash in their hands. This wasn't theory or promises. This was tangible proof that Caritas worked. Stoica had calculated that the psychological impact of these early success stories would be worth far more than the money he spent creating them. Each satisfied customer would bring in dozens of new investors, creating a viral marketing effect that no advertising budget could match. The mathematics of Caritas seemed miraculous but simple. Invest any amount, wait 3 months, receive 8 times your investment. A 800% return in just 90 days. To put this in perspective, the most aggressive legitimate investments might promise 10 to 15% annually. Caritas was promising 3,200% annually. But Stoica presented these numbers not as investment returns but as acts of charity, as blessings distributed to those most in need. He claimed the organization had mysterious benefactors, wealthy individuals and companies who wanted to help Romania rebuild. The money multiplying wasn't profit, it was divine providence. This religious framing was crucial because it bypassed rational financial analysis. People didn't question the mathematics of miracles. They simply had faith. And faith, as Stoica understood, was far more powerful than logic when it came to separating people from their money. Stoica knew that credibility required media validation, so he systematically bought it. Romanian journalism, still finding its footing after decades of communist censorship, was vulnerable to financial pressure. Cash-strapped newspapers and television stations couldn't resist the advertising revenue that Caritas offered. But Stoica went further than simple advertising. He paid for editorial content disguised as news reports. Journalists were given envelopes full of money to write glowing stories about Caritas's charitable mission. Television presenters praised the organization's benevolence during primetime broadcasts. Financial experts appeared on talk shows explaining how Caritas was revolutionizing Romania's economy. The coverage wasn't just positive, it was overwhelmingly enthusiastic. Viewers saw respected journalists and experts endorsing Caritas with apparent sincerity. This media blitz created an echo chamber of legitimacy that made questioning Caritas seem not just foolish but almost unpatriotic. Ioan Stoica was not your typical accountant. Methodical, calculating, and possessing an almost supernatural ability to read people's vulnerabilities, he had spent years studying the financial systems that had emerged in post-communist Eastern Europe. While others struggled to adapt to the new reality, Stoica observed the success of pyramid schemes in Russia and Albania. He watched how desperate people unfamiliar with modern financial concepts could be easily convinced to part with their money for promises of impossible returns. But Stoica wasn't content to simply copy existing schemes. He wanted to create something bigger, more sophisticated, more devastating. He understood that Romanians' deep-seated distrust of banks, combined with their desperate need for financial salvation, created the perfect conditions for manipulation. All he needed was the right approach, the right branding, and the right moment to strike. The choice of name was crucial, and Stoica knew it. Caritas. Latin for mercy, charity, love. It wasn't chosen randomly. In a country where 86% of the population belonged to the Romanian Orthodox Church, Latin carried religious authority and respectability. The word itself evoked images of charitable organizations helping the poor, of mercy extended to those in need. It suggested benevolence, selflessness, divine blessing. Stoica understood that Romanians, after decades of atheist communist rule, were rediscovering their faith and would be naturally drawn to anything that seemed blessed by religious authority. The name alone would open doors, create trust, and most importantly, disarm suspicion. When people heard Caritas, they didn't think of financial schemes or business ventures. They thought of salvation. And that's exactly what Stoica was counting on. Cluj-Napoca, 1992. The initial investors weren't wealthy businessmen or sophisticated financiers. They were ordinary people drowning in economic despair. Maria Popescu, a retired teacher whose pension had become worthless. Gheorghe Marinescu, a factory worker whose plant had closed. Ana Constantinescu, a widow struggling to feed her 3 children. These weren't people looking to get rich quick, they were people looking to survive. When Stoica's representatives approached them with promises of multiplying their modest savings 8-fold in just 3 months, it seemed like divine intervention. The amounts were small at first, 500 Romanian lei here, 1,000 Romanian lei there, but for families facing starvation, even these sums represented enormous sacrifice. They pawned jewelry, borrowed from relatives, scraped together every available penny. When the first payouts actually arrived exactly as promised, their relief and gratitude were overwhelming. They had found their savior. The mayor of Cluj-Napoca, Gheorghe Funer, became Caritas's most valuable political asset. Known for his nationalist rhetoric and populist appeal, Funer's endorsement carried enormous weight with ordinary Romanians. But his support wasn't given freely, it was purchased with briefcases full of cash and promises of continued financial support. Funer began promoting Caritas at public rallies, describing it as a patriotic Romanian success story that would help rebuild the nation. His endorsement opened doors throughout Romania's political establishment. Other mayors, county prefects, and even members of parliament began accepting Caritas money in exchange for their silence and implicit support. The corruption wasn't subtle. Stoica held lavish parties for politicians, gave them expensive gifts, and made sure they all became personal investors with guaranteed returns. By compromising the political class, he ensured that when questions about Caritas eventually arose, those in power would have strong incentives to look the other way. Perhaps no image captured the madness of Caritas better than the Hope trains. Specially chartered railway cars that transported thousands of investors from across Romania to Cluj-Napoca. These weren't ordinary trains, they were pilgrimage convoys carrying believers to their financial promised land. Families would travel for hours, sometimes days, clutching their life savings in paper bags and cloth bundles. The trains themselves became festivals of hope and desperation. Passengers shared stories of hardship, dreams of prosperity, and absolute faith in Caritas's promise. Children played in the aisles while their parents counted and recounted their money. Elderly passengers prayed openly, thanking God for sending them this opportunity. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. When these trains pulled into Cluj-Napoca station, they were met by Caritas representatives with banners and music, creating a carnival-like atmosphere that reinforced the sense that something magical was happening. By 1993, Caritas had expanded from a single office in Cluj-Napoca to a nationwide network of over 200 branches. Each office was designed to project prosperity and reliability. Marble floors, polished wood furniture, employees in expensive suits, everything calculated to impress visitors and justify their trust. The offices were always busy with long lines of people waiting to make deposits or collect their returns. This constant activity created its own credibility. Surely a scam couldn't operate so openly in so many locations with such apparent success. The employees, many of whom genuinely believed in Caritas's mission, provided enthusiastic customer service. They weren't trained salespeople, they were true believers who had seen the system work, who had watched their own investments multiply, who truly believed they were helping their fellow Romanians escape poverty. This authentic enthusiasm was far more convincing than any sales pitch could have been. Caritas transcended mere investment to become a genuine social phenomenon. Entire communities organized around participation in the scheme. Neighbors formed investment clubs, pooling their resources to make larger deposits. Families held meetings to decide how much they could afford to invest. Churches held special services praying for Caritas's continued success. The scheme created its own social hierarchy. Those who had joined early and received payouts became local celebrities, sought out for advice and inspiration. People who hadn't joined were viewed with suspicion or pity. In some communities, not participating in Caritas was seen as a sign of faithlessness or stupidity. The psychological pressure to join became overwhelming. Teachers, doctors, police officers, entire professional classes were swept up in the mania. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about belonging to something bigger than themselves. By late 1993, simple mathematics should have revealed Caritas's inevitable collapse, but mathematics had long since been abandoned in favor of faith. With hundreds of thousands of investors expecting eightfold returns every 3 months, the scheme required exponential growth that defied logic. If Caritas had 1 million lei in deposits, it needed 8 million to pay returns. But those 8 million would generate demands for 64 million in the next cycle. The progression was ruthless: 1 million, 8 million, 64 million, 512 million, over 4 billion within a year. Romania's entire money supply wasn't sufficient to sustain such growth. Financial experts who dared to point out these impossibilities were dismissed as pessimists or accused of working for foreign interests trying to destroy Romanian prosperity. The few voices of reason were drowned out by the overwhelming chorus of believers who had witnessed the miracle of multiplication with their own eyes. As money poured into Caritas, Ioan Stoica transformed from a modest accountant into Romania's most visible symbol of post-communist success. He bought luxury cars, expensive suits, and a mansion that became a pilgrimage site for investors hoping to glimpse their benefactor. His lifestyle wasn't hidden, it was deliberately flaunted as proof of Caritas's prosperity. The more extravagantly he lived, the more convinced investors became that unlimited wealth was flowing through the organization. Stoica held lavish parties attended by politicians, celebrities, and business leaders. He donated money to charities and churches, creating photo opportunities that reinforced his image as a benevolent figure. Every public appearance was carefully orchestrated to project success, generosity, and divine blessing. He understood that his personal wealth needed to be visible and enviable because it served as the ultimate advertisement for his scheme. By 1993, international financial experts and foreign governments were issuing warnings about Caritas, but these warnings only strengthened Romanian support for the scheme. The Romanian media, bought and paid for by Stoica, portrayed foreign criticism as evidence of international jealousy and conspiracies against Romanian success. When the International Monetary Fund expressed concerns about Caritas's impact on Romania's economy, supporters claimed this proved that foreign powers feared Romanian financial independence. The U.S. Embassy issued warnings to American citizens about pyramid schemes in Romania, which Caritas supporters interpreted as confirmation that they had discovered something so valuable that America was trying to stop it. This xenophobic framing was particularly effective in a country that had just emerged from decades of isolation and was suspicious of foreign interference. Every international warning became proof that Caritas was succeeding beyond all expectations. 1994 marked the absolute peak of Caritas mania. An estimated 8 million Romanians, nearly half the country's population, had invested in the scheme. Entire regions had been economically transformed by Caritas money. Small towns that had been dying after factory closures suddenly experienced booms as residents received their multiplied investments. Real estate prices skyrocketed as newly wealthy Caritas beneficiaries bought homes and land. Car dealerships couldn't keep up with demand. Restaurants and shops that had been empty for years were suddenly packed with customers flush with Caritas cash. The economic impact was so dramatic that some economists argued Caritas was actually helping Romania's transition to capitalism by injecting liquidity into the economy. Regional newspapers published stories of families whose lives had been completely transformed by their Caritas investments. Children who could now attend university, medical treatments that could finally be afforded, businesses that could be started. Even at its peak, cracks were beginning to show in Caritas's facade. Payments that had once arrived exactly on schedule began experiencing delays. When investors complained, they were told that the organization was experiencing temporary liquidity issues due to its rapid expansion. New offices were being opened faster than they could be properly staffed. The quality of customer service began declining as overwhelmed employees struggled to process the enormous volume of transactions. Some investors reported receiving partial payments instead of their full returns, though these complaints were quickly suppressed by the organization's media allies. Regional managers began reporting difficulties transferring money from the central office in Cluj-Napoca. Most ominously, Stoica himself began appearing less frequently at public events, claiming to be busy with international expansion plans. These warning signs should have triggered alarm. But the vast majority of investors remained convinced that any problems were temporary growing pains in an otherwise miraculous system. Romania's newly democratic government faced an impossible situation. They knew Caritas was a pyramid scheme that would eventually collapse, but they also knew that millions of their citizens were invested in it. Taking action against Caritas risked triggering the very collapse they wanted to prevent, potentially destroying the life savings of nearly half the country's population. Moreover, many government officials had themselves invested in Caritas, creating massive conflicts of interest. The political calculus was brutal. Shutting down Caritas would make the government responsible for the financial devastation that followed, while allowing it to continue meant enabling an even larger disaster. Prime Minister Nicolae Vacaroia privately admitted to colleagues that Caritas represented the greatest threat to Romania's democratic transition, but publicly maintained that the government couldn't interfere with private business arrangements. This paralysis allowed the scheme to continue growing even as everyone in power knew it was doomed. Romania wasn't the only post-communist country experiencing pyramid scheme mania. Similar scams were operating in Albania, Bulgaria, and Russia, but none reached the scale and penetration of Caritas. International observers were watching Romania's experiment with fascination and horror, understanding that its outcome would influence similar schemes throughout Eastern Europe. The World Bank issued reports warning that pyramid schemes in transitional economies could destabilize entire regions. Academic economists published papers analyzing the phenomenon, trying to understand how such obviously unsustainable schemes could achieve such widespread acceptance. Some theorists argued that pyramid schemes were an inevitable byproduct of rapid economic transition, a painful but necessary part of financial education for populations unfamiliar with market economics. Others warned that the social trauma caused by massive pyramid scheme collapses could undermine democracy and capitalism throughout the region. Spring 1994 brought the first undeniable signs that Caritas was failing. Payments that had been delayed became payments that never arrived. Investors who showed up at offices demanding their returns were told that their paperwork was being processed, or that computer systems were experiencing technical difficulties. Lines that had once moved quickly began stretching for hours as overwhelmed staff struggled to handle the volume of complaints. The most telling sign was the change in atmosphere at Caritas offices. The excitement and celebration that had characterized earlier visits was replaced by anxiety and growing anger. Employees who had once been enthusiastic evangelists for the system began making excuses and avoiding eye contact with investors. Word began spreading through communities that something was seriously wrong. But for many investors, the alternative to believing in Caritas was accepting that they had lost everything they owned. The psychological impact of Caritas's failure was as devastating as the financial damage. People who had been convinced they were financially secure suddenly faced the reality that they had been deceived. The shame was overwhelming. They had sold their homes, borrowed money from relatives, convinced their neighbors to invest alongside them. They had been evangelists for their own destruction. Families that had been celebrating their good fortune found themselves facing homelessness and hunger. The social fabric of entire communities began unraveling as people realized that their friends and neighbors had been living the same lie. Support groups formed spontaneously as people tried to cope with the trauma of realizing they had been systematically deceived. Mental health professionals reported a surge in depression, anxiety, and suicide attempts. The phrase Caritas victim became part of the Romanian vocabulary, carrying connotations of both sympathy and stigma. By summer 1994, peaceful complaints had given way to angry protests outside Caritas offices. Investors who had lost their life savings demanded answers, money, or someone to hold accountable. The protests began small but grew as word spread through communities that had been devastated by the collapse. In Cluj-Napoca, thousands of people surrounded the main Caritas headquarters, chanting demands for Stoica to appear and explain what had happened to their money. Police were called to maintain order, but many officers were themselves Caritas investors, creating uncomfortable situations where law enforcement had to protect the organization that had defrauded them. The protests spread to other cities as the scope of the collapse became clear. What had begun as financial fraud was becoming a threat to public order and political stability. The government could no longer pretend that Caritas was a private matter that didn't require official intervention. The Caritas collapse exposed the depth of corruption in Romania's political system. Investigations revealed that dozens of politicians had received money from Stoica in exchange for their support and silence. Mayor Gheorghe Funer, who had been Caritas's most visible political champion, suddenly claimed he had been deceived along with everyone else. Other officials who had attended Stoica's parties and accepted his gifts now distanced themselves from the organization. Parliamentary hearings were held to investigate the government's response to Caritas, revealing embarrassing details about how much officials had known and how little they had done. The political damage was severe, several high-ranking officials resigned, and public trust in the new democratic institutions plummeted. Citizens who had already lost faith in communism now began losing faith in capitalism and democracy as well. The Caritas scandal became a symbol of the corruption and incompetence that seemed to characterize post-communist Romania. Ioan Stoica's arrest in August 1994 was anticlimactic after the drama of the preceding months. He didn't flee the country or go into hiding, he simply waited in his mansion until police arrived to take him into custody. His calm demeanor during the arrest infuriated investors who had lost everything and expected to see him show some remorse or fear. During his interrogation, Stoica maintained that he had genuinely believed Caritas could succeed, that he had been trying to help Romania's economic development. He claimed that the collapse had been caused by negative media coverage and government interference, not by any fundamental flaws in the system. This refusal to accept responsibility only deepened the anger felt by his victims. The man who had promised to be their savior continued to portray himself as a visionary who had been undermined by forces beyond his control. Stoica's trial became a focal point for national grief and anger about the Caritas collapse. The courthouse was surrounded daily by protesters demanding justice for the millions of people who had been defrauded. Inside, prosecutors presented evidence of a massive pyramid scheme that had operated with full knowledge of its inevitable collapse. They showed how Stoica had used new investors' money to pay earlier ones while siphoning millions for his personal use. The defense argued that Stoica had been operating a legitimate business that had been destroyed by media hysteria and government interference. They claimed he was a scapegoat for broader economic problems that weren't his fault. The trial revealed shocking details about the scale of the scheme. Over $3 billion had flowed through Caritas, equivalent to one-third of Romania's entire money supply. The complexity of tracking all the money and victims meant the trial dragged on for months while public anger continued to simmer. The sentence that Ioan Stoica ultimately received, just 18 months in prison, was widely viewed as a travesty of justice. For a crime that had devastated millions of lives and destabilized Romania's economy, the punishment seemed absurdly light. Legal experts explained that Romania's outdated laws hadn't anticipated crimes of this scale and sophistication, making it difficult to prosecute pyramid schemes effectively. Moreover, Stoica's lawyers had successfully argued that much of the money had been lost due to economic conditions beyond their clients' control, not criminal intent. The light sentence sparked new protests and deepened public cynicism about Romania's justice system. Victims who had lost their homes, their savings, and their hopes for the future watched the man responsible serve less time than many people convicted of petty theft. The message seemed clear: steal a little and face serious consequences, but steal billions and receive a slap on the wrist. Despite extensive investigations, the vast majority of money that flowed through Caritas was never recovered. Estimates suggested that between $3 and $5 billion had disappeared, but tracking its ultimate destination proved nearly impossible. Some money had been paid out to early investors, some had been spent on Caritas's operations and Stoica's lifestyle, and some had simply vanished into offshore accounts and complex financial arrangements that investigators couldn't penetrate. The Romanian government hired international forensic accountants to trace the missing funds, but they recovered less than 10% of what had been lost. This meant that millions of Caritas victims never received any compensation for their losses. Families that had invested their life savings were left with nothing but worthless receipts and bitter memories. The failure to recover the stolen money added insult to injury, making it clear that the victims would bear the full cost of their misplaced trust. The Caritas collapse had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate financial losses. An entire generation of Romanians became deeply suspicious of any investment opportunities, legitimate or otherwise. Banks struggled to attract depositors because people associated any promise of returns with pyramid schemes. Foreign investors found it difficult to establish credibility in a country where the population had been so thoroughly burned by financial fraud. The psychological trauma affected family relationships, community bonds, and social trust in ways that persisted for decades. Children who had watched their parents lose everything to Caritas grew up with deep skepticism about capitalism and financial institutions. The scheme had promised to help Romania transition to prosperity but instead created lasting barriers to economic development. Even today, Romanian financial regulators cite Caritas when warning about investment scams, and the name remains synonymous with broken promises and shattered dreams. Ioan Stoica died in 2017, alone and in poverty, a fitting end for a man who had built his fortune by exploiting others' desperation. His death received little media attention, a stark contrast to the celebrity status he had enjoyed during Caritas's peak. Most of his victims had long since stopped thinking about him, focused instead on rebuilding lives that had been shattered by his scheme. The mansion where he had once entertained politicians and celebrities was sold to pay debts, and his expensive cars were auctioned off. In the end, the man who had promised to multiply everyone's wealth had managed only to multiply suffering. Caritas remains a cautionary tale not just about financial fraud, but about the dangers of desperation, the power of false hope, and the terrible price of misplaced trust. It stands as a reminder that in times of crisis, when people are most vulnerable, there will always be predators ready to exploit their pain for profit.